May 326 BC, the banks of the Hydaspes River in what is now Punjab, Pakistan. Alexander of Macedon, just 30 years old, stood on the western shore and stared across the swollen waters at an army unlike any he had faced before. After nearly a decade of conquest, after defeating the Persian Empire, after marching his men through mountains and deserts, through territories that stretched from Greece to the edge of the known world, he now confronted something that would test every lesson he had learned, every tactical innovation he had mastered, and every ounce of courage his men possessed. War elephants, massive creatures that towered over horses, their trumpeting screams echoing across the river, their armoured bodies carrying towers of archers. King Porus, of the power of a kingdom, had positioned 200 of these beasts in the centre of his defensive line, daring the Macedonians to cross. The monsoon season had transformed the Hydaspes into a raging torrent, deep and fast-flowing, its waters brown with silt from melting Himalayan snows. Any direct assault would be suicide. Porus knew it. Alexander's men knew it. But Alexander had not conquered half the world by accepting impossible odds. He had made a career of turning strategic nightmares into tactical masterpieces. The question was not whether he could cross the river. The question was how. To understand what happened at the Hydaspes, you need to understand how Alexander arrived there in the first place. His campaign into India was not some spontaneous adventure. It was the logical conclusion of his conquest of the Persian Empire. The territories along the Indus River had once been Persian satrapies, provinces controlled by the Achaemenid dynasty since the time of Darius the Great 2 centuries earlier. When Alexander defeated Darius III at Gaugamela in 331 BC, he claimed not just the Persian heartland but every territory that had ever paid tribute to Persia. In his mind, he was not invading India. He was simply taking possession of what already belonged to him. After securing Bactria in what is now Afghanistan, after subduing the fierce mountain tribes of the Hindu Kush, after capturing the seemingly impregnable fortress of Ornos, a place where legend claimed even Heracles had failed, Alexander crossed the Indus River in 327 BC and entered the Indian subcontinent. Most local chieftains, intimidated by the reputation of the Macedonian army, chose diplomacy over warfare. They paid tribute, they provided supplies, they became allies. Among these was Ambi, the ruler of Taxila, whose kingdom stretched from the Indus to the Hydaspes. Ambi had his own reasons for welcoming Alexander. He had a powerful enemy to the east, King Porus. The relationship between Ambi and Porus was hostile. Some sources suggest they were rivals for regional dominance. Others indicate long-standing territorial disputes. Whatever the cause, when Alexander arrived, Ambi saw an opportunity. He opened the gates of Taxila, one of the richest cities in the region, and placed his considerable resources at Alexander's disposal. In return, he asked for Alexander's help against Porus. For Alexander, the alliance made perfect strategic sense. He could not afford to leave a hostile kingdom at his back as he moved deeper into India. Porus controlled the territory between the Hydaspes and Acacine's rivers, blocking the route east. To continue his campaign, Alexander had to either secure Porus as an ally or defeat him in battle. Alexander sent envoys to Porus demanding submission. The message was simple: acknowledge Macedonian authority, pay tribute, keep your throne. Many kings had accepted these terms. Porus refused. The refusal was not based on ignorance of Alexander's capabilities. News of the Macedonian victories had spread throughout India. Porus knew exactly what he was facing, but he was a king, and his duty was to defend his kingdom. He would not bend the knee to a foreign invader, no matter how many battles that invader had won. So Porus gathered his forces and marched to the Hydaspes River, the western border of his domain. He positioned his army on the eastern bank and prepared to repel any crossing attempt. In the spring of 326 BC, Alexander's army arrived at the Hydaspes and established camp on the western shore. What he saw across the river must have given even him pause. Porus had assembled a formidable force. Ancient sources vary on the exact numbers, but most agree on approximately 30,000 infantry, between 4,000 and 6,000 cavalry, 300 war chariots, and somewhere between 85 and 200 war elephants. The most striking element was the elephants. The Macedonians had encountered elephants before, possibly at Gaugamela, where some Persian forces used them, but never in these numbers and never as the centerpiece of an enemy battle plan. These were Indian war elephants trained from birth for combat, accustomed to the chaos of battle, each one capable of devastating a cavalry charge or trampling infantry formations. They were positioned every 50 feet along the front line, creating a living wall of tusks and trunks and armoured bodies. Behind them stood the infantry, in front of them the chariots. On the flanks, cavalry units ready to strike at any force that managed to cross the river. Porus himself was a figure of legend. Ancient historians describe him as standing over 6.5 feet tall, a giant by the standards of the ancient world, his physical presence matching his reputation for courage. He commanded from atop his largest elephant, not from a howdah or protective tower, but seated on the animal's neck in full view of his troops and the enemy. He wore chainmail armour, carried weapons befitting a warrior king, and made clear he would fight personally in any battle. The message was unmistakable. The Hydaspes River was the line. Any Macedonian who crossed it would face the full fury of the Parava army. The river itself was the first obstacle, the monsoon. Season was beginning. Heavy rains swelled the waterways throughout the region. The Hydaspes, normally fordable at several points, had become a torrent. It was deep enough that horses would have to swim in places. The current was strong enough to sweep men away if they lost their footing. The far bank was held by an alert enemy with clear sight lines. Any conventional crossing would result in disaster. Troops emerging from the water would be disorganized, exhausted, vulnerable. The elephants and cavalry would slaughter them before they could form up. Alexander understood this perfectly, so he did what he always did when faced with an impossible tactical situation. He improvised, he deceived, he outthought his opponent. The campaign that followed would be remembered as one of the most brilliant river crossings in military history. Alexander began with psychological warfare. Every night his cavalry would ride up and down the western bank, making noise, lighting fires, conducting what appeared to be reconnaissance for crossing points. Porus, naturally cautious, shadowed these movements with his own forces, marching his army along the opposite shore, maintaining position to block any crossing attempt. Night after night this pattern repeated. Macedonian cavalry probing, Indian forces responding, no actual crossing attempted. Gradually Porus began to relax. He concluded it was a bluff, that Alexander was waiting for the monsoon season to end and the river to subside. To reinforce this impression, Alexander made a public show of having large grain shipments brought into camp from Taxila. He ordered his men to settle in, to build more permanent structures, to give every appearance of preparing for a long wait. Knowing that Porus had spies in his camp, he let it be known that the army would not attempt a crossing until autumn. But while conducting this deception, Alexander was planning the real operation. He had brought boats with him, vessels that had been used to cross the Indus River. These had been disassembled, transported overland in sections, and reassembled on the Hydaspes. 30 oar galleys were cut into 3 parts, smaller boats into 2. The sections had been carried on wagons, hidden from enemy observation. Now they were being put back together, but not at the main camp. Alexander's cavalry reconnaissance had been genuine as well as deceptive. His officers had been searching for suitable crossing points, reporting back with detailed information. About 17 miles upstream from the main camp they found what they needed, a bend in the river where a wooded island divided the channel. The island was uninhabited, covered with thick vegetation that would conceal movement. The western approach was hidden from the opposite bank. If they could reach the island unseen, cross to it, then ford the second channel, they could land a significant force on the eastern bank before Porus could react. The plan that emerged was complex, requiring precise coordination and nerves of steel. Alexander would personally lead an elite strike force in a night crossing at the upstream location. This force would include the companion cavalry, the Hydaspes, Agrianian light infantry, archers, and 2 battalions of the phalanx, in total roughly 11,000 men. Meanwhile, Craterus, one of Alexander's most trusted generals, would remain at the main camp with a substantial portion of the army, including additional phalanx units and cavalry. His orders were specific. Do not cross the river while Porus is watching, but the moment Porus moves his main force to engage Alexander upstream, cross immediately and attack from behind. To complete the deception, Alexander stationed 3 additional officers with their units at intermediate positions along the river between the main camp and the crossing point. Meleger, Attalus, and Gorgias, Each commanded mixed forces of infantry and cavalry. Their role was to create confusion, to make multiple feints, to keep Porus guessing about where the real threat would come from. The entire operation depended on surprise and speed. If Porus realized what was happening and repositioned his forces before Alexander crossed, the plan would fail. If the crossing took too long and Indian reinforcements arrived, Alexander's strike force would be trapped with the river at their backs. The night chosen for the crossing was characterized by a violent thunderstorm. This was both blessing and curse. The storm provided cover, drowning out the sounds of men and horses moving through the darkness. The heavy rain reduced visibility to near zero. But it also made the crossing more dangerous, the river more treacherous, the night march more difficult. Alexander led his force inland, following a route that kept them out of sight of the opposite bank. They moved in silence, weapons muffled, horses carefully guided. The rain turned the ground to mud, but it also meant that any Indian scouts who might spot them would be huddled under shelter rather than patrolling. As they approached the crossing point, they found the fleet waiting. The boats had been prepared in advance, hidden among the trees. Alongside the reassembled galleys were rafts made from leather skins stuffed with hay, a technique Alexander had used before on the Danube and the Oxus. These skins were sewn tight to make them watertight, then lashed together to create floating platforms. The storm began to subside as dawn approached. This was the moment. Any delay and they would be spotted. Alexander and his command staff boarded one of the galleys. The troops followed, loading onto boats and rafts, maintaining discipline despite the darkness and the danger. They pushed off from the western bank and for a time they were concealed by the island. But as they moved further into the river, as the current caught them and pushed them downstream, they broke into open water. Enemy scouts on the opposite bank saw them. Riders galloped away to bring word to Porus. The Macedonians were crossing. But where they would land was still unclear. The first problem Alexander encountered was unexpected. What had appeared from the western bank to be the mainland was actually another island. A narrow but deep channel separated it from the true eastern shore. By the time this became apparent, dawn was breaking and there was no time to reconsider. The men would have to ford this second channel. They entered the water on foot, horses swimming beside them. The current was fierce. Some men went under, their heads barely above water, struggling to maintain footing on the riverbed. But they made it. They reached the actual eastern bank and began to form up. Alexander had achieved surprise. He had landed a significant force on the enemy side of the river, but now he had to fight. Porus, receiving reports of the crossing, initially could not believe it. He could see Craterus's forces still in position at the main camp. How could Alexander have crossed upstream without being observed? But the reports kept coming, and finally he accepted the reality. The Macedonians were across. He had to respond. But Porus faced a dilemma. If he moved his entire army upstream to engage Alexander, Craterus would cross behind him and attack his rear. If he divided his forces, he might be defeated in detail. He made a decision that showed both his tactical awareness and his limitations as a commander. He would send his son with a portion of the army, primarily cavalry and chariots, to drive Alexander back into the river, or at least delay him while Porus repositioned the main force. It was a reasonable response to an unexpected situation. It was also a fatal mistake. The younger Porus led his contingent north at speed, approximately 2,000 cavalry and 120 chariots according to most sources. They encountered Alexander's force as the Macedonians were still organizing after the crossing. For a moment it seemed the gambit might work. The chariots charged, the Indian cavalry maneuvered to flank. But Alexander had planned for this contingency. He had brought mounted archers, Scythian cavalry skilled in the use of the composite bow. These horse archers did not engage in close combat. Instead, they circled the Indian formations, raining arrows down on the chariots and exposed cavalry. The heavy companion cavalry, Alexander's elite shock troops, formed up and charged without even fully deploying into line of battle. The Indian chariots, formidable on dry ground, proved almost useless in the mud near the riverbank. The wheels bogged down, the horses struggled. The vehicles that had been designed to strike terror into enemy lines became immobile targets. The Macedonian cavalry crashed into the Indian formation with overwhelming force. The younger Porus fought bravely, but he was outnumbered and outmaneuvered. His force was routed. He himself was killed in the melee, along with most of his officers. The survivors fled back toward the main army, bringing news of the disaster. Meanwhile, Alexander consolidated his position and began marching south, parallel to the river, to link up with the rest of his forces. Porus now understood the full scope of the threat. This was not a raid or a probing attack. Alexander was across the river with a substantial army. If Porus remained at his original position facing Craterus, Alexander would attack him from the side or rear. He had to turn his army to face the new threat. He left a small detachment to watch Craterus, hoping to deter a crossing. Then he marched the bulk of his forces north to meet Alexander. The two armies met on relatively flat ground several miles from the river. This was the terrain Porus had been waiting for. Open space where his elephants could operate effectively, where his superior numbers in infantry could be brought to bear. He formed his battle line with confidence. The elephants were positioned in the centre, spaced approximately 50 feet apart, creating a living barrier. Behind them stood the infantry, 30,000 strong. The elephants would serve as anchors, preventing cavalry charges, breaking up enemy formations. The cavalry was split between both flanks, with the chariots positioned in front of the cavalry wings. Porus himself took position on his largest elephant, a massive bull elephant in the prime of life. Ancient sources describe this animal with something approaching awe. It was intelligent, loyal, and ferociously protective of its rider. Throughout the coming battle, this elephant would demonstrate remarkable behavior, fighting fiercely when Porus was strong, defending him when he was wounded, even carefully kneeling to allow him to dismount when he could no longer sit upright. Alexander surveyed the Indian position and immediately understood the problem. A frontal assault against the elephants would be carnage. The phalanx, his heavy infantry armed with the sarissa, pikes ranging from 13 to 21 feet long, were trained to fight in tight formation. But elephants could smash through such formations. The animals would grab soldiers with their trunks, hurl them through the air, crush them beneath their feet. The infantry archers in the towers on the elephants' backs would rain arrows down on the tightly packed ranks. Cavalry charges against elephants were almost impossible. Horses, even trained war horses, were terrified of elephants. The smell, the size, the alien nature of the creatures caused horses to panic and refuse commands. So Alexander made a decision that revealed his tactical brilliance. He would not attack the centre. He would attack the flanks. He would use his cavalry superiority to destroy the Indian cavalry wings, then encircle the entire enemy army before engaging the elephants. He concentrated his cavalry on his right wing, under his personal command. This included the companion cavalry, the elite mounted force that had carried him through every major battle, along with mounted archers and additional cavalry units drawn from his conquests across Asia. On his left wing, he placed infantry and a smaller cavalry force under the command of Conus, one of his most capable officers. The phalanx battalions were held in the centre, but ordered not to advance until the cavalry had done its work. The battle opened with Alexander leading a charge against the Indian left cavalry. The Macedonian horsemen struck with precision and overwhelming force. The Indian cavalry, brave and well-equipped but less disciplined than their opponents, began to give ground. Simultaneously, Alexander sent his mounted archers to harass the Indian right cavalry, keeping them occupied and unable to reinforce the left. Porus, seeing his left cavalry collapsing, made the natural decision. He ordered his right cavalry to swing across behind his infantry line and reinforce the threatened flank. For a moment, this seemed to stabilize the situation. The Indian cavalry from both wings were now concentrating against Alexander's right. But this is exactly what Alexander had been waiting for. The moment the Indian right cavalry moved, it exposed that flank. Conus, following the plan Alexander had laid out before the battle, immediately advanced with his cavalry and struck the now undefended Indian right wing from behind. The Indian cavalry found themselves caught between two forces, Macedonian cavalry in front and Macedonian cavalry behind. They were compressed, unable to maneuver, taking casualties from all sides. In desperation, they broke away and fled toward the centre of their own line, seeking protection among the elephants. This was the turning point. The Indian cavalry, which had been supposed to protect the flanks of the army, was now a disorganized mob clustering around the elephants. The Macedonian cavalry had achieved complete superiority on both flanks. Now they could turn their attention to the real target. The elephants began to move forward, responding to commands from their mahouts. These were the elite drivers, Men who had trained with these specific animals for years, who knew every gesture and sound, who could direct the elephants with precision. The elephants charged toward the Macedonian cavalry that was attempting to encircle them. And for a time, the tactic worked. Horses refused to approach the massive beasts. Cavalry units that tried to charge were scattered by the trumpeting, thrashing, terrifying animals. The elephants grabbed Macedonian soldiers with their trunks, lifted them high, and slammed them to the ground. They crushed men under their feet. The archers in the towers fired arrows with deadly accuracy into the cavalry formations below. This was what the elephants had been trained for, and they were devastating. But Alexander had planned for this. He had brought specialized troops specifically to deal with the elephants. Light infantry, Agrianian javelin men, archers and Thracian peltests, mobile skirmishers who were not equipped for line combat but were perfect for harassing a large, slow target. These troops moved in the gaps between the elephants, exploiting the spacing that Porus had deliberately left to allow the animals room to maneuver. They did not try to fight the elephants directly. Instead, they targeted the mahouts. Javelins, arrows, and stones from slings rained down on the drivers. One by one, the mahouts fell. Some elephants, their drivers killed, continued to follow their training, but with less precision, less control. Others stopped, confused. Still others, wounded and bleeding from multiple projectile hits, began to panic. An elephant in pain is a creature of pure chaos. They do not distinguish between friend and enemy. They simply flee from the source of pain, trampling anything in their path. The Macedonian light infantry began targeting the elephants themselves, aiming for vulnerable spots, the eyes, the trunk, the soft skin under the belly and behind the legs. The wounds were not individually fatal, but they were agonizing. The elephants, driven mad by pain and fear, began to turn. They crashed back into their own infantry formations. They trampled Indian soldiers. The careful battle line that Porus had constructed dissolved into confusion. The Indian infantry, which had been protected behind the wall of elephants, was now exposed. They were caught between rampaging elephants behind them and Macedonian cavalry on their flanks. The phalanx, which had been held back, now advanced. The sarissa, that extraordinarily long pike, gave the Macedonians a reach advantage that proved decisive. The Indian infantry, armed primarily with swords, axes, and shorter spears, could not close with the phalanx without being impaled. The long pikes created a hedge of steel that was almost impossible to penetrate. The Indian infantry, brave and numerous, pressed forward. But the casualties were horrific. Men were speared before they could strike a blow. The phalanx advanced slowly, methodically, pushing the Indians back step by step. And then Craterus arrived. He had seen Porus move his main force north. Following Alexander's orders, he immediately began crossing the river. It took time to get his entire force across, but once he did, he marched rapidly to join the battle. He struck the Indian rear with fresh troops. The Indians were now surrounded, Macedonian cavalry on both flanks, the phalanx pressing from the front, Craterus's forces hitting from behind, the elephants, maddened and uncontrolled, creating chaos in the centre. The battlefield became a killing ground. The slaughter that followed was immense. Ancient sources provide varying casualty figures, but all agree the Indian losses were catastrophic. Diodorus Siculus reports 12,000 killed and 9,000 captured. Arrian, drawing on the account of Ptolemy who fought in the battle, suggests as many as 20,000 infantry and 3,000 cavalry were killed. Modern historians generally accept that at least 12,000 Indians died that day, possibly many, more. Among the dead were Porus's 2 sons and his ally Spitacles, along with most of his senior commanders. Around 80 elephants were captured alive. Many more died on the battlefield. The Macedonian losses were significantly lower, but still substantial. Arrian reports around 330 killed, though Diodorus gives higher figures of over 700 infantry and 280 cavalry. When wounded are included, Macedonian casualties may have reached 1,000 men. These were among the highest casualties Alexander's army had suffered in any single battle. The elephants had taken a terrible toll before they were finally neutralized. Porus himself fought to the bitter end. Ancient historians describe him as a figure of almost superhuman endurance. He was wounded multiple times, struck by arrows and javelins, bleeding from numerous injuries, but he remained mounted on his elephant, commanding his forces, refusing to flee. Only when the battle was clearly lost, when his army had been destroyed around him, when he could no longer hold his weapons, did he finally collapse. His elephant, demonstrating that remarkable intelligence that ancient sources describe, carefully knelt down to allow the wounded king to dismount. Alexander, who had been pursuing Porus personally, immediately stopped when he saw the king fall. He sent Ambi, the Taxilan ruler who had been fighting alongside the Macedonians, to offer terms. This was a mistake. Porus, seeing his rival and enemy approaching, tried to attack him despite his wounds. Ambi barely escaped. Alexander tried again, this time sending an Indian officer named Meroz, who Porus knew and respected. This time, Porus agreed to meet with Alexander. The encounter that followed has become one of the most famous moments in Alexander's career. Porus was brought before the Macedonian king. Despite his wounds, despite his defeat, he stood straight and met Alexander's eyes. Ancient sources emphasize his dignity, his refusal to be cowed. Alexander, who admired courage above almost all other qualities, was impressed. He spoke first. "How should I treat you?" The question was a test. Many defeated kings grovelled, offered servitude, begged for mercy. Porus did none of these things. He gave an answer that has echoed through history. "Treat me as one king would treat another king." Some historians question whether Porus actually said these exact words, noting that the phrasing seems almost too perfect, too philosophical. But whether those were his precise words or a later embellishment, the sentiment was clear. Porus refused to beg. He demanded respect. Alexander granted it. Not only did he spare Porus's life, he allowed him to retain his kingdom. He added territory to Porus's domain, including lands conquered from neighbouring tribes. He treated the defeated king as an ally rather than a subject. This was both genuine respect and calculated politics. By showing mercy to a brave opponent, Alexander sent a message to every other Indian kingdom. Resist, and you might be destroyed. But fight bravely and lose honourably, and you will be treated fairly. It was masterful psychological warfare wrapped in chivalric gesture. 2 cities were founded to commemorate the battle. On the eastern bank, where the fighting had taken place, a city called Nicaea, from the Greek word for victory. On the western bank, at the crossing point, another city named Bucephala. This city was named for Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, the great warhorse that had carried Alexander from Macedonia to India, that had been with him since he was a boy, had died. The exact circumstances are disputed by ancient sources. Some claim Bucephalus died of wounds sustained in the battle. Others, including Arrian drawing on the testimony of Onesicritus who was there, state that the horse died of exhaustion and old age. He was approximately 30 years old, ancient for a horse, and had campaigned through some of the harshest terrain in the world. The modern town of Jalalpur Sharif in Pakistan is traditionally identified as the site of Bucephala and the burial place of Bucephalus. For Alexander, the loss of Bucephalus was deeply personal. The horse had been with him since he was 12 years old, when he had tamed the supposedly unredeemable stallion by realizing it was afraid of its own shadow. Bucephalus had carried him at the Granicus River, at Issus, at Gaugamela, through every major battle of the conquest. Ancient sources describe Alexander's grief as profound. Some historians see the death of Bucephalus as symbolic. The horse died in India, at the limits of Alexander's eastward expansion. It marked an ending. The Battle of the Hydaspes was Alexander's last major battle. He would fight smaller engagements, but never again would he face a major opponent in a pitched battle. The victory demonstrated his tactical genius. The night crossing, the deceptive feints, the coordination of multiple forces, the refusal to attack the enemy's strength, and instead targeting the flanks. All of it showed Alexander at his best, but it also revealed the limits of his army's endurance. The Macedonian soldiers had been campaigning for nearly 8 years. They had marched from Macedonia through Asia Minor, down through Syria and Egypt, across Mesopotamia and Persia, through the mountains of Afghanistan, across the Indus, and now they were deep in India. They were exhausted. Their equipment was wearing out. Many had been wounded multiple times. They longed for home. After the battle, Alexander prepared to continue east. He had heard reports of the kingdoms beyond the Hydaspes, particularly the powerful Nanda Empire that controlled the Ganges Valley. Greek sources claim the Nanda army was enormous, perhaps 5 times the size of Alexander's forces, with thousands more war elephants. Whether these reports were accurate or exaggerated is impossible to determine. What mattered is that Alexander's soldiers believed them. They had just faced 200 elephants and found the experience terrifying. The thought of facing 2,000 or 3,000 elephants in the next battle broke their will. When Alexander's army reached the Hydaspes River, now called the Bays, roughly a month after Hydaspes, they refused to go further. This was not quite a mutiny. The soldiers did not turn on their officers, they did not threaten violence, but they made clear, through their spokesman Conus and other senior officers, that they would not march another step east. They had fought for Alexander for 8 years. They had conquered the known world. Enough was enough. They wanted to go home. Alexander was furious. He retreated to his tent and refused to see anyone for 3 days, hoping his soldiers would change their minds. They did not. Finally, after consulting the omens and receiving what was interpreted as divine confirmation that he should turn back, Alexander agreed. They would return. But the return journey would not be a simple march back along the routes they had come. Alexander led his army south, following the Indus River toward the sea, fighting a series of brutal campaigns against the tribes of the lower Indus Valley. The march to the ocean and the subsequent journey through the Gedrosian desert was a catastrophe. Thousands died from heat, thirst, and disease. By the time the army returned to Babylon in 323 BC, it was a shadow of the force that had crossed into India. Alexander himself would die in Babylon that same year, at the age of 32, from causes that remain disputed. Fever, possibly malaria or typhoid, or perhaps poisoning, ended his life before he could organize any new campaigns. The significance of the Hydaspes extends beyond the immediate military outcome. It represented the high watermark of Macedonian expansion eastward. It demonstrated that Alexander could defeat any opponent through superior tactics and leadership. But it also showed the limits of human endurance, and the impossibility of conquering the entire world with a finite army. The battle introduced the Mediterranean world to Indian military culture, particularly the use of war elephants. Alexander himself incorporated captured elephants into his forces. His successors, particularly the Seleucid dynasty, that controlled much of the Asian portion of his empire, would make extensive use of elephants in their own armies. The Romans, when they fought Pyrrhus of Epirus and later Hannibal of Carthage, would face elephants in battle and develop their own tactics for defeating them. Tactics that drew on the lessons Alexander learned at the Hydaspes. For India, the battle marked a turning point. Alexander's incursion, though brief, opened sustained contact with the Hellenistic world. When Alexander's successors divided his empire, the Seleucid kingdom continued to interact with Indian states. These interactions facilitated cultural and technological exchange. Greek artistic styles influenced Indian art, particularly in the Gandhara region. Indian philosophy and religious ideas flowed westward. Trade routes were established that would eventually become part of the Silk Road network. The Mauryan Empire, which rose to power shortly after Alexander's departure, adopted and modified Macedonian military techniques. Chandragupta Maurya, the founder of that empire, may have actually met Alexander. Later Indian military theorists, particularly Chanakya, also known as Kautilya, analysed the Battle of the Hydaspes and drew lessons from it. Kautilya's Arthashastra, an influential treatise on statecraft and military strategy, emphasises the need for professional standing armies and systematic military training, lessons drawn directly from the Macedonian example. The battle also secured Porus's place in history. Although he lost, he is remembered as Alexander's most formidable opponent. Historian Peter Green argues that Porus's performance surpassed that of Memnon of Rhodes, the Greek mercenary commander who fought for Persia, and Spitamenes, the Bactrian resistance leader. Porus fought Alexander to a standstill at the river, forced him to execute a complex and risky crossing, and in the battle itself inflicted some of the highest casualties Alexander's army ever suffered. Porus remained loyal to Alexander after the battle, governing his expanded territories as a Macedonian satrap. He was assassinated several years later, after Alexander's death, by Eudemus, one of Alexander's generals, during the chaos that followed the breakup of the empire. The tactical lessons of the Hydaspes influenced military thought for centuries. The emphasis on mobility over direct strength, the use of combined arms with cavalry, infantry, and specialized light troops working in coordination, the importance of reconnaissance and intelligence, the value of deception and surprise, all of these became standard elements of military doctrine. Alexander's handling of the elephant specifically became a case study. He demonstrated that a seemingly invincible weapon could be defeated not through matching strength, but through identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities. By targeting the mahouts and the animals themselves with ranged weapons. By using the terrain and spacing between elephants to maneuver light infantry into position. By forcing the elephants to panic and turn on their own forces, he turned the Indian army's greatest strength into a liability. The psychological dimension of the battle is equally fascinating. Alexander's willingness to personally lead the most dangerous part of the operation, the night crossing of a hostile river, inspired his men to follow him. Porus's decision to fight on his elephant rather than from a safer position behind his lines demonstrated his personal courage and inspired his own troops. The mutual respect between the two commanders after the battle, the famous exchange about treating kings like kings, showed that honour and dignity could coexist with ruthless warfare. Some modern historians have questioned the traditional narrative of the battle. They point out that all surviving accounts are from Greek sources, written by men who were either present with Alexander or who drew on accounts from Macedonian participants. No Indian sources from the time of Porus survive. We have only the victor's version of events. This raises questions. Were the casualty figures exaggerated to make Alexander's victory seem more impressive? Was the initial elephant assault as devastating as described? Or did Greek writers emphasize it to enhance the achievement of defeating it? Was Porus as magnanimous in defeat as the sources suggest, or is that a later romanticization? These are legitimate questions. History is always written by those who survive to write it, and victors control the narrative. But even accounting for potential exaggeration and bias, the basic facts remain. Alexander crossed a major river in the face of an enemy army. He defeated a significantly larger force that was fighting on its home ground, with battlefield weapons his troops had never faced before. He achieved this through tactical innovation, personal leadership, and the disciplined execution of a complex battle plan. That much is not in dispute. The Battle of the Hydaspes occupies a unique place in Alexander's career. It was his last great victory. It pushed the boundaries of Macedonian power to their absolute limit. It showed Alexander at the height of his abilities, successfully adapting to an unfamiliar enemy and unfamiliar tactics. But it also foreshadowed the end. His beloved horse died there. His army's morale broke shortly afterward. Within 3 years, Alexander himself would be dead, and his empire would fracture into warring successor states. For the men who fought there, the battle must have been unlike anything they had experienced. Macedonian veterans who had faced Persian chariots and Greek hoplites and Scythian horse archers now confronted creatures from what seemed like another world. The psychological impact of fighting elephants should not be underestimated. These were animals that could kill with ease, that could not be stopped by conventional weapons, that seemed impervious to fear. The Indian soldiers defending their homeland showed remarkable courage. They stood their ground even as their cavalry was destroyed, even as the elephants turned on them, even as the Macedonian phalanx ground forward. When their line finally broke, it was not through cowardice but through simple impossibility. They were surrounded, outnumbered at the point of contact despite their overall numerical superiority, and facing some of the most experienced soldiers in the ancient world. The modern visitor to the battlefield site would find little remaining from that day in 326 BC. The exact location is disputed, though most scholars place it somewhere in the vicinity of modern Jhelum in Pakistan. The river has shifted course over more than 2 millennia. The landscape has changed, but the strategic principles demonstrated there remain relevant. The importance of intelligence and reconnaissance, the value of operational flexibility, the necessity of adapting tactics to enemy capabilities, the potential for unconventional approaches to succeed where direct attacks would fail. These lessons are as applicable in modern warfare as they were in the age of Alexander. The battle also highlights the role of leadership in military success. Alexander did not simply order his men to attack. He led from the front. He made the dangerous river crossing with the first wave. He personally commanded the cavalry charge that broke the Indian flank. He exposed himself to the same dangers his soldiers faced. This was not reckless bravado. It was calculated leadership. Alexander understood that soldiers fight harder for a commander they can see, a leader who shares their risks. In the feudal and monarchical societies of the ancient world, personal courage was expected of kings and generals, but Alexander took it further. He made himself visible, recognizable, a presence on the battlefield that inspired his troops and terrified his enemies. Porus demonstrated similar leadership qualities. He could have commanded from safety behind his lines. Instead, he fought from the most visible and vulnerable position, mounted on an elephant in full view of both armies. When the battle turned against him, he did not flee. He fought until he could no longer hold his weapons. His soldiers saw their king's courage and fought with equal determination. The respect Alexander showed Porus after the battle was not simply magnanimity. It was recognition from one warrior king to another. These two men from vastly different cultures, speaking different languages, worshipping different gods, understood each other in a way that transcended their circumstances. They were both products of societies that valued martial prowess, personal honour, and the responsibilities of leadership. The treatment of Porus became part of Alexander's legend. It was cited as evidence of his nobility, his philosophical education under Aristotle, his vision of a unified empire where local rulers could maintain their dignity and authority while acknowledging Macedonian overlordship. Whether Alexander's motives were purely noble or pragmatically political, the gesture was effective. News of Porus's treatment spread throughout India. Other kingdoms saw that cooperation with Alexander brought rewards, not just subjugation. This soft power complemented the hard power demonstrated on the battlefield and made Alexander's subsequent campaigns in the region more manageable. The elephants captured at the Hydaspes became prizes distributed throughout the Macedonian forces. Many were sent back to the Western territories, where they became symbols of exotic conquest. They were used in subsequent battles and eventually bred in captivity. The Seleucid kings who controlled Syria, Mesopotamia and Persia after Alexander's death maintained elephant core for centuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt attempted to do the same, though they used smaller African forest elephants rather than the larger Indian species. The Romans, who eventually conquered the Hellenistic kingdoms, inherited this tradition. Roman triumphs sometimes featured captured elephants. Roman generals fought against elephant-equipped armies in their wars against Pyrrhus and Hannibal. The tactics developed at the Hydaspes, refined over centuries, eventually allowed the Roman legions to overcome these animals through disciplined infantry formations, specialized javelins designed to kill elephants, and the use of fire and noise to panic the beasts. By the time of the late Roman Empire, elephants had largely disappeared from Western military use. They were expensive to maintain, required specialized training, and were vulnerable to the tactics that had been developed against them. But in India, elephants remained central to military forces for centuries after the Hydaspes. Subsequent Indian kingdoms continued to use them. The Mughal armies of the 16th and 17th centuries still deployed elephants in battle. Only with the introduction of gunpowder weapons did elephants finally become obsolete on the battlefield. In that sense, Alexander's victory at the Hydaspes demonstrated not that elephants were ineffective weapons, but that no weapon system, no matter how formidable, is invincible. Every military technology has vulnerabilities. Every tactic has a counter. Alexander's genius was in identifying those vulnerabilities and devising methods to exploit them, even when facing a weapon his forces had never encountered before in such numbers. The engineering aspects of the battle deserve mention as well. The disassembly of boats, their transport overland, and their reassembly on the Hydaspes demonstrated remarkable logistical capability. This was not improvisation. It required advanced planning, skilled craftsmen, proper tools and materials, and the organizational capacity to coordinate the effort. The Macedonian army was not just a fighting force. It was a mobile military state with engineers, craftsmen, quartermasters, and administrators who made Alexander's campaigns possible. The night march to the crossing point, conducted in a thunderstorm through unfamiliar territory, required guides who knew the land, scouts who had previously reconnoitred the route, and troops disciplined enough to maintain silence and formation in terrible conditions. The coordination between Alexander's strike force, Craterus's holding force, and the intermediate units positioned along the river required a command and control system that functioned reliably despite the limitations of ancient communication. All of this infrastructure of conquest, the unglamorous but essential components of military success, was as important to victory as the heroism of individual soldiers or the genius of Alexander's tactics. The monsoon timing of the battle added another layer of difficulty. The rain that concealed Alexander's crossing also made everything harder. Bowstrings became wet and lost tension, reducing the effectiveness of archers. Metal armour grew heavy with water. Footing became treacherous. Visibility dropped. The river itself was at its most dangerous. Yet Alexander chose to fight during the monsoon precisely because it made the river seem uncrossable, lulling Porus into a false sense of security. He accepted the hardships because they enhanced the surprise. This willingness to operate in conditions that most commanders would consider prohibitive was characteristic of Alexander's entire career. He repeatedly achieved success by doing what his enemies believed impossible: crossing the Danube on improvised boats, marching his army through the desert to surprise besieged cities, scaling cliffs that defenders thought unclimbable, crossing the Hindu Kush in winter, and now fording the Hydaspes during the monsoon. The psychological warfare component of the campaign before the crossing shows Alexander as more than just a battlefield commander. He understood that winning the battle began before the fighting started. By conducting false starts night after night, he trained Porus to ignore Macedonian movements along the river. By ostentatiously preparing for a long siege, he convinced Porus that no crossing would be attempted soon. Then, when Porus's guard was lowered, when the Indian scouts had grown complacent, Alexander struck. This was information warfare before the term existed, shaping enemy perceptions and exploiting cognitive biases. Porus fell victim to what modern military theorists would call normalcy bias, the tendency to underestimate threats that appear routine. The late 20th century study of the Battle of the Hydaspes by military historians emphasized its relevance to modern warfare. The US Army Command and General Staff College includes the battle in its curriculum on river crossing operations. The principles demonstrated there, reconnaissance, deception, multiple crossing points, combined arms operations, all remain relevant. While the specific technologies have changed, the underlying tactical and operational concepts remain sound. The human element, courage and cowardice, leadership and followership, discipline and chaos has not changed at all. Modern reenactment societies and historical researchers have attempted to recreate elements of the battle to better understand what happened. These efforts are necessarily limited. We no longer have access to war elephants trained for combat. We do not know precisely what the terrain looked like in 326 BC. The weapons and armour must be reconstructed from archaeological evidence and written descriptions. But even limited reconstructions provide insights. The sheer length of the sarissa, the Macedonian pike, becomes apparent when you try to wield one. The weight of a full panoply of armour, perhaps 70 pounds of bronze and leather, helps explain both the protection it provided and the exhaustion soldiers must have felt fighting in it. The difficulty of maintaining formation while marching on uneven ground illuminates the level of training required. These physical realities, often lost in written accounts, shape the battle as much as strategic decisions. The legacy of the Hydaspes battle in literature and art has been significant. Ancient historians Arrian, Plutarch, Diodorus Siculus, and Quintus Curtius all covered it in their accounts of Alexander's campaigns. Medieval and Renaissance writers retold the story. In the Islamic world, Persian and Arabic sources preserved memories of the battle, often emphasizing Porus's courage and dignity in defeat. In India, Porus became a symbol of resistance against foreign invasion, a king who fought bravely even though outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Modern Indian nationalism has sometimes embraced Porus as a hero, though the historical Porus remained loyal to Alexander after the battle and integrated his kingdom into the Macedonian system. European painters of the 18th and 19th centuries depicted scenes from the battle, particularly the encounter between Alexander and Porus. These paintings, while historically questionable in details, captured the imagination of audiences who saw in the story themes of nobility, courage, and the respect between honourable enemies. The battle has been analysed in military academies, discussed in philosophical treatises on leadership and strategy, and referenced in discussions of cultural encounter and imperial expansion. For anyone studying Alexander the Great, the Hydaspes is essential. It shows him at his best, creatively solving an almost impossible problem, leading from the front, respecting worthy opponents, and achieving victory through intellectual superiority as much as military force. It also shows the limits of his power and the growing exhaustion of his army. The death of Bucephalus symbolized the end of an era. The subsequent refusal of his troops to march further east demonstrated that even Alexander's charisma and leadership had limits. No commander, no matter how brilliant, can indefinitely demand the impossible from his soldiers. At some point, human endurance breaks. Alexander reached that point at the Hydaspes River, just weeks after his greatest victory. The Battle of the Hydaspes thus stands as both a triumph and a turning point, a demonstration of military genius and a harbinger of the end. Alexander defeated Porus, but he could not defeat geography, climate, and human fatigue. In the end, those enemies proved more formidable than any army.